Thank you very much, Dr. Gordon. It's been 25 years since Oakalla closed. It's pretty incredible to think that there's so much interest in a place that's been closed for a quarter of a century. I started at Oakalla almost 30 years ago to the day, and I was just turned 20 years old, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, had no idea what I was getting myself into. What an incredible place Oakalla was. A 79-year history, so many events happened there, and it was truly my experience as a young correctional officer that prompted me to write a history book about Oakalla Prison. I would talk to these old guards who'd been there forever, and same as inmates who had gone through the system a couple of times, and they remembered what Oakalla was like back in the 60s and 70s. And for me, it was just a fascinating experience to hear about all this conflict and turmoil. And so really the history of Oakalla is a history of crime and punishment in not only the Lower Mainland, but also British Columbia. It's a reflection of the ideas towards the punishment and treatment of inmates back in the early days. And we see the documentation on the history of Oakalla is really a documentation of the history of corrections. And we see that there was an evolution, a punishment era that lasted from the opening of Oakalla up until about the 1950s. And then it transformed into this rehabilitation medical model treatment of prisoners, where the focus was that inmates were sick and ill, and that there was something medically wrong with prisoners. That's why they were getting involved in crime. And then finally we see or saw what I would refer to as a reintegration era, where there was a focus on removing prisoners from places like Oakalla and putting them, and a focus on community-based corrections. Which was all fine, but for Oakalla, it actually had a very detrimental effect on the institution and the prisoners in there, because there was very little programs for them to do during that period. So really this talk today is, I'm going to take you through the history of Oakalla. My experiences were very limited. I was only there for 3.5 years before I got into policing, but it was something that I thought, we really need to document this history, and so that's what I set out to do, and wrote a book. And so I was happy to come talk about it again. It's stories that I haven't related for a long time. My family and friends have heard the same stories over and over again, so they're sick of it, but you're a fresh audience, and so you get to hear these stories again. I'm happy to see that this is actually also a bit of a mini Oakalla reunion. I see about 10 people here today that I used to work with in the prison, so I'm happy to have you guys here, and it's great to see you again. So Oakalla, how did Oakalla come to be? So dating back to pre-Oakalla days, what was happening in the Lower Mainland? Well, there was a provincial institution in New Westminster, and it had 27 cells. And it basically served the entire Lower Mainland. So in the early 1900s, New Westminster was sort of the hub city, and then there was the city of Vancouver. But the population, as soon as we had the turn of the century, the population was growing exponentially in the Lower Mainland. And so as the population grew, so did the crime rate grew, and then we had a period in the early 1900s of high unemployment in the Lower Mainland, all across Canada actually, and so a lot of people were laid off, and they were coming west to sort of escape the harsh winters, and they had very little food, and at that time, vagrancy was actually a crime, and you could be arrested and sent to prison for being a vagrant. Also, during that era, Canada and British Columbia in particular was a fairly racist province. What had happened in the turn of the century was there was, as I mentioned, high unemployment. And there was a lot of people, migrants, especially Asians, who had previously worked on the railroad, things like that, who were also out of work. And generally, they would work for less money than the more recent, or the settled people who had lived here, the whites, if you will. And so there began to grow these racist organizations called, well, for one was the Asiatic Exclusion League, which pressured the government of the day to say, listen, you probably shouldn't be hiring Asian people because they're taking jobs away from the people who've lived here, the established residents of the Lower Mainland. And in the early 1900s, 1907, we actually had race riots in Vancouver, where this mob of the Asiatic Exclusion League, walked through the streets of Chinatown, smashing windows and breaking storefronts for these Asian business owners. And I'll tell you why that's important in a second. So we had this problem, overcrowding at the New Westminster Jail. There were several reports that said, the inmates are not having good living conditions there. We need to build a new prison to replace the New Westminster Jail. So a call went out for tenders and location, and they decided that on 185 acres on the south side of Deer Lake was an ideal location to build a centrally located prison, provincial institution that would service the entire Lower Mainland. And so calls were put out to design the prison. So Hugh Hodgson was awarded as the architect for the prison, and so he designed it. And he was a well-known architect in the Lower Mainland. He had designed several schools, Inglewood Secondary School in West Vancouver, most notably, as well as a lot of high-end homes. The contract to the building of the prison was awarded to Smith and Sherborne, who were paid $267,000 for the contract to build a prison. And the provincial government of the day put this into the contract. And I'm reading directly from what the contract says. The contractor shall not directly or indirectly employ Chinese, Japanese, or any other Asians upon, about, or in connection with the works, and in the event of doing so, the government will not be responsible for paying this contract. Can you imagine something like that being written today? So they got the contract, and they started building the prison. The problem was the population at the New Westminster Jail was overflowing, and it was going to take several years to build the concrete facility. So a temporary jail was built. So the first prison at Oakalla was actually this 2-story wooden building. It was capable of housing 100 inmates. It was built in a horseshoe-shaped fashion. The north wing was administrative wing, and on the top floor were 6 residences for the guards. So the guards actually lived on the site. And then there was an east wing and a west wing. On the south side was just a concrete wall. So the first prisoner to be admitted to Oakalla, his name was William Daly, who was 32 years old. He had been arrested on the streets of Vancouver for stealing fountain pens worth more than $10, and he was sentenced to 1 year hard labor. And so he was originally in the New Westminster Jail, and then an order in council was signed to transfer him to the newly built jail at Oakalla. The reason why they picked Daly was because he was reported to be a good cook. So he served 1 year in Oakalla, and he was just discharged on June 10th, 1913, and he was handed $27 by the guards who had collected all this money to send him on his way and wish him well. Well, he must have been a really good cook, because a guard's salary at that time was $85 a month. So half a month's pay for just a going away present, not bad. So when we think about Oakalla, this is what we think of. There were many other buildings that were built after the fact that I'll allude to a little bit later. But this is the main jail, as we call it, built in 1914. And as you can see, there is the, let's see if I can figure this thing out. That's not how I figure it out. There's the east wing, west wing. The north wing was an administrative wing, and then the south wing is on the south side. So now it looks like there's only 3 levels to Oakalla, or layers to the prison blocks, but actually, if you think about the exterior of Oakalla as a shell, that's really what it was. The main cells were these interior cells that were in the east and west wing. There were 20 cells on the left side of a cell block, and then 20 cells on the right side. Facing back to back, and there was a corridor that a guard could walk down the middle between the cells with a little slot where they could sort of look in and peer in each cell. On the outside was a tier that was only about 3 feet wide for the guards to walk down, or the inmates to live on if they weren't locked in their cells. It was pretty modern for its time. The cells had running water, toilets, had its own bed and a sink. So there, in the East Wing and the West Wing, there were 160 cells, plus some punishment cells on the lower level. The South Wing was actually built for women prisoners at the time, and there were only 54 cells. Later on, the South Wing became the remand center. So Oakalla was a provincial institution that was built for inmates serving a sentence of 2 years or less. And it was also a remand center for inmates who were awaiting trial on serious charges, up to and including murder. The other thing Oakalla was, it also carried out all executions for anyone who had been sentenced to death as an order of punishment in British Columbia. So here's the South Wing. So it would have been about here, on the second level, were the gallows. Originally they were outside, but when they moved inside, the gallows were on an abandoned elevator shaft on the second floor of the South Wing, which, when I worked there, was our lunchroom, which was kind of weird. So, the only thing left from Oakalla today, if you were to go out there, are these stairs right here. Those little stairs leading up to the front door of the main jail, that's all that's remaining. And on the other side of the stairs is a kid's playground. So right where the main jail was is a kid's playground. So I was over there the other day and I walked up the stairs and I kind of looked around and said, okay, well, this is the administration wing. So the north wing was the administration wing. And I kind of paced myself off. And it was like, okay, so it was about 50 feet to the center block, and then a few more feet. Okay, this right here, this would be where the gallows were. I stand there looking, and there's a kid's slide that would deposit the kids, whoop, right where the gallows were. And I thought, that's a little creepy. So you're not taking your kids there, I hope, are you? I don't do that. Oh, and just about those stairs. So again, looking at this. So the top floor was an observation area. Originally, it was the infirmary. The hospital was built later. So it became an observation area for the most difficult inmates who couldn't function in the normal population, who couldn't function in the South Wing. So people like Clifford Olson, when he was there, he was kept in that observation area. So you see those little silver outlining around the little courtyard on the roof? That was their exercise area. So if you're an observation inmate, you had that little exercise area. That candy cane fencing was put in many years later, but in the 1930s, when it was an infirmary, prior to that type of fencing being put in, it was just a regular chain link fence. An inmate climbed up on the top of it, and there's a big brass sign there. That's the British Columbia crest, and it says Splendor Sine Occasu, which means splendor without diminish in Latin. And it's got the ram and the stag holding up the sign. Well, the inmate climbed up onto that sign, and the guards and the warden came down and tried to talk him off. Didn't work. He jumped to his death, and he landed on those stairs. So again, probably, I don't know, weird when you're walking up those stairs thinking about who's been there. That guy. So when Oakalla was built, obviously this is the punishment era, as I mentioned. When an inmate first arrived in the prison, they were handed the jail rules and regulations. And they were like, here you go. There was also the rules and regulations were posted in their cell. And I just took a sampling of some of these rules and regulations just to give you an idea of what it was. The first duty of a prisoner is strict obedience. Strict silence must be observed in all parts of the jail. Prisoners shall always approach all jail officials in a respectful manner, speak in a respectful tone of voice, and in as few words as possible make their request known. I actually changed that to my children, and I posted it on their bedroom doors. They don't listen. No lights shall be allowed in any of the cells. No prisoner shall give anything to another prisoner. Prisoners sentenced to hard labor shall labor diligently. And if you didn't, you were sent to the hole. So this reflected the Auburn style of prisons that was common at that day, where inmates were kept in isolation in their cells at night, forbidden to speak. Forbidden reading materials, except maybe a Bible. The purpose was contemplation of the evil that they had committed, and then to work very hard during the day. I like this rule. I didn't post it on here, but this was the last rule. Every prisoner will find it in his or her interest at all times to conform to these rules and to carefully read them over. But if a prisoner is unable to read, they will be read over and explained to them by an officer on application in writing at a reasonable time. So I guess probably didn't happen a lot. Inmates could be submitted to corporal punishment. Now the jail rules and regulations allowed for the paddle. Now the paddle was a 3-foot long, thick leather strap, if you will, that had all these little holes drilled in it, which would decrease wind resistance. If an inmate was to be paddled, the guards would bring them into an office. They would have their legs and arms strapped to the table and then their trousers lowered. And then a blindfold put over the inmate's head so they couldn't see who was doing it. And then the guards would actually shuffle around the table so they would never know who actually was the person who had the paddle and who administered the punishment. The lash was actually had to be administered, or had to be a sanction imposed by the courts. So an inmate, if they disobeyed the rules and regulations, would only receive a paddle for corporal punishment. But if you had committed rape or armed burglary or some other, I think there's 3 or 4 offenses where a lash could actually be administered to people. Other forms of punishment were bread and water diet, solitary confinement in a dark cell with or without bedding, not to exceed 6 days for any offense, nor 3 days at a time. So pretty dungeon-like conditions. So I thought I'd talk about a couple of cases. I'm not going to spend too much time going into great detail about the specific cases, but to just kind of give you a flavor of some of the different types of events that occurred in and around Oakalla. Again, like I said, the history of Oakalla is really the history of crime and punishment in British Columbia. So I'll talk about a couple of these cases and we'll see how it goes. So, you know, Prohibition was a great thing for Canada, not so much in the United States. So for a number of years, in 1920 especially, there was Prohibition in the United States. In Canada, it was great for business because we had liquor flowing here and it made rum runners very wealthy by bringing whiskey and Canadian gin and all that down to the United States. And the west coast of British Columbia was perfect because we're very close to the United States, obviously, and then our border is kind of that weird zigzag fashion. So if you have a boat, it doesn't take very much to dart in and out a couple of islands and now you're in the United States. So normal families if you will, were actually making a lot of money on the side by getting themselves a little boat, going to the liquor store, buying a whole bunch of gin and whiskey, taking it down to the United States and selling it and making fortunes out of people like Al Capone. So there's this guy named William Gillis who lived in Vancouver, and he had a 17-year-old son, and they were basically rum runners, and this was their boat, the Beryl G. Beryl was his daughter's name. And, you know, law enforcement up in Canada kind of turned a blind eye to it. I mean, it wasn't illegal to, you know, possess liquor, so they really didn't care. And even the authorities in the United States was like, well, you know what, as long as you give us a piece of the action, we're okay. And so we had these characters like Owen Cannonball Baker and Harry Myers and Charlie Morris and Paul Strompkins. They were pirates because it's one thing to buy the liquor and then transport it down to the United States, but it's even better if you stop those people and steal all their booze from them and then take it down to the United States. It doesn't cost you anything, it's pure profit. So one day, the Beryl G's heading to meet with this steamship Comet, offloads 300 cases of whiskey and London Burnett's gin, and they take it down. They're on the way to the United States, but they actually had to get more. I think it was double the amount of whiskey and gin, but because the Beryl G was so small, they'd have to make 2 trips. So they made 1 trip successfully, they come back for the next trip. So Cannonball Baker and his buddies, they see this and they're like, let's intercept this guy. So they pick him up when he's got the liquor, and they pretend they're the law doing an inspection. And they board the boat and they murder the son and the father. Kill the father first, murder the son second. It was pretty vicious. First they were shot, then their bellies were sliced open, anchors tied to them, handcuffs tied to them, thrown overboard so their bodies would never be found. So a missing persons report is made, and Forbes Cruikshank from the BC Provincial Police, he's assigned to the case. And there's a couple of pieces of evidence that really led to the successful conclusion. One was the guys in the Barrel G had actually taken a photo of the boat when it showed up to do the inspection. And so they had a serial number from the boat. There was also a gold-trimmed hat left behind. Long story short, they ended up making the connection. Inspector Cruikshank figured out who was responsible. Found Stromkins pretty quickly down in Seattle, but the other guys had taken off. Morrisville was also found later in Seattle. So this Harry Myers guy, he takes off to New Orleans. Now, can you imagine? So a wanted poster is put out for him. Somehow this wanted poster ends up in New Orleans. And some cop down there arrests this kid who gave an alias during Mardi Gras. And he's letting the guy go, and he's like, geez, that guy looks familiar. But he can't place it, so he's talking to this kid, and the guy says, well, you know, I'm heading to start a new life. I'm going to South America. I'm going to take a ship to South America. And he goes, okay, see you later. Goes back to the office and starts thumbing through these wanted posters, and there's, lo and behold, there's a picture of Myers. And he's like, oh my God, I just let that guy go. So he goes down to the docks, and he's actually he's boarding a boat to go to Mexico. And so he fortunately stopped him. Baker was found working at a fish plant or something in New York. So even back in the 1920s, wanted posters worked, which was surprising. Anyway, so they're all arrested, sent back to Oakalla to face trial. On the way back to Oakalla, Myers had written a confession letter. Felt really bad. The officer from the British Columbia Provincial Police had, basically escorted him all the way back across North America. So they got to know each other really well, and he confessed to the crime and he wrote this long confession letter. But then when he's back in Oakalla, he kind of changes his mind. He's like, yeah. So he's like, okay, I'm going to write a letter to Baker, who's also now on death row. Here's how we get out of this, right? Fortunately, that letter, which we call a kite in prison, was intercepted by a guard and used at the trial against him. So they're hanged at Oakalla, but it was an interesting way that the media and the newspapers of the day would represent these events. Very high profile. You'd have 100 people in this center courtyard of Oakalla Prison. So in the early days, prior to the 1930s, they were actually hanged in that open courtyard of the old jail. A wooden scaffold would be built, 13 steps leading up to the platform. The guards would escort the prisoners to the top of the platform with the official hangman. They would then they would already have their arms pinioned behind their backs. Their legs would then be strapped once they're on the platform. And the official executioner would then go about his work. There would be a priest there who would read the Lord's Prayer. Once the Lord's Prayer was finished, they'd pull the lever and the men would be sent to their death. Interesting how these two, it's almost like reading a graphic novel, reading the newspaper story of the day. It talks about how they were casually puffing on cigarettes and the rain was lightly falling on the ground and there was a mist in the air as these two men went to their death. So there was 44 people hanged at Oakalla. Those two weren't the first. Alex Ignace was, who had killed his wife. Alex Paulson and Alan Robinson, they had committed a murder, robbed a Mr. Salisbury, who was the son of a Canadian Pacific Railway executive, on the streets of Vancouver, Georgia Street, in the middle of the night. Tried to rob him, but this guy was a very strong, popular oarsman, and he decided to fight back with these two. Little did he know that one of them had a handgun. Shot and killed him. And then they took off, and it was a VPDA officer ended up arresting both of them. And they pointed fingers at each other, saying each other was the person who pulled the trigger. Judge didn't care, executed both of them. Interesting case again for those who are living in the area. So the newspaper of the day said that Alan Robinson's body was claimed and sent back to his family in Eastern Canada, but Alex Paulson, no one claimed his body, which was interned at the cemetery on Oakalla grounds. Now, I've done a lot of research on this topic, and I can't find any record of a cemetery on Oakalla grounds or that there was ever a body exhumed. So you may have some bones being dug up by your dog one day on Mr. Paulson. You know, each story, each hanging, it's a fascinating subject for me, but it's, you know, they are all tragic events. And you know, some really horrific crimes have occurred in British Columbia over the years where people were sentenced to death as a result of them. You know, I just did some quick facts. 19 men had shot their victims. 5 had stabbed them and slashed their throats. 3 had killed their victims with an axe. Others had used blunt objects such as hammers, pieces of wood, a bottle, and one guy was stomped to death. Several killers suffocated or strangled their victims. Again, some of them are just really horrific cases. Lawrence Vincent, Evan Buck, and Gerald Eaton were all child killers, sexually assaulted and murdered children. Others were robberies, home invasions gone bad. A couple of them were bank robberies where they shot and killed the tellers. Many were crimes of passion. Some of them had killed their wives, some of them had killed their ex-wives. One had killed his mistress, one killed the husband of his mistress. Leo Mantha, the last person hanged at Oakalla Prison in 1959, he killed his lover, who was Aaron Jenkins. Aaron worked, worked for the Navy seaman. He was stationed at HMCS Naden in Esquimalt. The two of them had actually had a quarrel earlier on in the day. Aaron Jenkins had told Leo Mantha that their homosexual relationship was going to end and that Aaron was actually going to marry his girlfriend. Leo was very upset about this. He actually snuck onto the Navy base in the middle of the night, went into the barracks while everyone was sleeping and stabbed Leo Mantha to death, or stabbed Aaron Jenkins to death. Horrific case. There are many more. 4 people were sent to death for killing police officers. Joe Gordon, down on the bottom here, he killed a Vancouver police officer, shot and killed him 3rd and Fur Street. I'll talk about Harry Meadows in a second, but Richardson George and Enos George. Interesting case. Those two were brothers. And there were actually 4 people involved, 4 brothers involved in the murder of 2 British Columbia provincial police officers up in Merritt. What had happened was Enos George had stabbed his wife, and she lived though, but she had gone to the city for medical attention. She told police that her husband, Enos George, had stabbed her. So the police said, hey, we're coming to arrest George, and so they went onto the reserve to go arrest him, but Enos had met up with his 3 other brothers, and when the 2 police officers got there, the 4 brothers attacked the 2 police officers, beat them badly, put them in a car, took them down to the Nicola River, and chucked them in the river, and they died. Richardson George and Enos George and 3rd brother, Alexander George, were all tried for murder. The youngest George, Joseph George, he had actually been shot by one of the police officers but lived, but he had had brain damage, so they never charged him with murder as a result of the damage that he had suffered. But the other 3 brothers were charged and convicted. Alexander George was so young, I think he was 20, so he was commuted to a life sentence. So Enos George and Richardson George and Charles Russell, who had killed a teller in a bank robbery gone bad, were executed at the same time. It was the only triple hanging at Oakalla Prison. Now the actual door, the trap doors, are only 4 feet by 4 feet. So you are standing front to back, like 3 in a row when they were hanged. They probably would have hanged Earl Dunbar on the same day, but there wasn't enough room, so they hanged him 21 days later. Now, the interesting thing about the George brothers is 10 years after Enos George was hanged, there was a province newspaper story that said a female was once hanged at Oakalla, Inez George. But you can see it's just a typo. It was Enos George, not Inez George. But it started a rumor that perpetuated. Even when I started working there, I remember people telling me, oh yeah, a woman was once hanged here too. And I was like, really? Then I started doing the research, found this out. When Oakalla closed in 1991, the Vancouver Sun said a woman was once hanged at Oakalla. So some people weren't doing their research. So I'll talk about an escape. This is the escape of McDougall and Wilcox back in 1931. So these two characters had been arrested for a bunch of robberies across the Lower Mainland. In Fraser Mills, they had gone out to a store that had recently cashed the checks for all the employees. There was a mill there. A lot of the employees would cash their checks there and spend it at the bar and the store and things. So these guys knew that they were going to be loaded, so they went and robbed them. Wilcox was a tall guy, but he had a distinguishable scar that ran across his face, and so he was pretty identifiable to the victims. And McDougall was really identifiable because he was 5'2", and so people would, quickly point him out in a lineup as well. But these guys had done about 10 robberies across the Lower Mainland when they were arrested. So they had a bunch of court appearances, and they were going to court kind of every day or other day after they were arrested. And so they would make the daily journey by wagon. Vancouver police wagon would pick them up at Oakalla and escort them down to the courthouse. And at the end of the day, they'd be escorted back out. So it wasn't too long before these guys made contact with their friends in the community and said, we're looking at big time, right? Going to the big house for a long time, we're going to the penitentiary, we'll never escape from there, it's got 40-foot high concrete walls, if we're ever going to escape, it's going to be now. So one day while they're in court on March 5th, 1931, buddies of theirs bring some handguns wrapped up in cloth and sneak it into the police wagon and put it underneath the bench that's parked outside the courthouse. So they get to Oakalla, to the front steps of Oakalla, and they've got these guns secreted on them. So these two poor guards, Brown and Rutledge, they're on duty in the administrative wing. They're booking these guys back in when they're attacked by these two guards, or by these two inmates. And so they've got 3 guns on the 2 of them, and they basically tie up the 2 guards. They kick them pretty bad, beat them up pretty badly, and handcuff them with their own handcuffs behind the counter. And they steal the keys to the front gate here, to this door, exit door. So they just get to the exit door. Well, lo and behold, at the same time, there's this Victoria police officer with his prisoner coming up the steps. He's about to admit some prisoner into Oakalla, and all of a sudden he gets to the front door, and these 2 clowns come out the door, and they're brandishing guns. So they take the gun away from the police officer. Now they've got 4 guns. And they say to the inmate, you want to come with us? And he's like, no, I'm good. Back in that time, taxis would actually come onto the ground to pick up prisoners who were being released or whatever, and I guess there was an inmate who was going to be released soon, so there was a taxi waiting for them too. So they jump into the taxi and they head out of town and they get into the streets of Burnaby and they jump out of the taxi. And they're on the lam for a couple of days, and they end up turning up in different places. There's a couple of sightings of them across the Lower Mainland. This poor Constable Holiday, he gets dispatched to suspicious guys hanging around 29th and Imperial Avenue out here in Burnaby. And he goes there, he doesn't know who's there. These guys got the drop on him. They take his gun too, tie him up. They got more guns than they know what to do with now. A couple days later, there's a report of a suspicious persons near Grandview Highway and Boundary Road. Now, Grandview Highway and Boundary Road today is Canada Way and Boundary. And if you look at the intersections, which I'll show you in a second, it's actually Laurel and Smith. Well, 19th Avenue is now Laurel, and Smith is still there. So you can see it. There's a very nice Starbucks right on the corner. You can usually find a detective or 2 from the Vancouver Police Department having coffee there on any given day. At any rate, so Chief Devitt, who's the chief of the Burnaby Police Department, and his partner Noel Pennington are assigned to investigate. So this is a little factoid that maybe some of you don't know, is that Burnaby once had its own municipal police department. Some of you may know that there was the BC Provincial Police, which policed most of British Columbia up until 1950, and then the RCMP took over policing for most of the municipalities, including Burnaby in 1950. But from 1892 to 1935, the municipality of Burnaby had its very own municipal police force, and Chief Devitt was the chief. William Devitt was the chief, and he was a rough, tough kind of take-no-crap guy, and he says, you know what, I'm going to handle this myself, right? There's, of course, suspicious activity. He thinks, okay, now I think it's these two escapees. So him and Noel Pennington decide to head down, and they also send a couple of motorcycle cops into the area just in case these guys get away. Well, he finds them, and they end up in a shootout with Chief Devitt and Wilcox with McDougall and Pennington as well. And so this is the newspaper article of the day, and I kind of laugh to myself when I think about how times have changed. You know, you would need the little legal disclosure underneath, not actual shooting of victims, you know, not drawn to scale, victims not actually wearing black clothing, no known gun or smoke rings coming from rifles. So they get into a shootout, and I'm going to read you, spoiler alert, Chief Devitt's testimony at the coroner's inquiry the very next day. When I was about 20 yards from the car, I called out to them to surrender, that we were police officers. Wilcox was standing then just at the back of the car, which had been driven off to the road in right angles. He did not seem to be armed, but suddenly he pulled out two revolvers and started to fire. I heard the bullets singing over my head, but in the excitement I could not say how many shots he fired. And then I let him have it. My shot struck his trigger finger, smashing it. It seemed to me that he pulled the dangling finger off and tossed it into the bush. Then he staggered backwards and collapsed. McDougall had run around to the front of the car and was banging away. I fired at him once. I don't know if the bullet went through the windshield or not, but there was a mark over his eyes. After he surrendered, that looked as though he had been sprayed with flying glass. Constable Pennington was coming down 19th Street with a shotgun, and McDougall, seeing him, realized he was trapped in the open. I guess he didn't like the look of that shotgun much either. I shouted to him to put them up, and then a moment later I told him to put them up again or I'd drill him. McDougall then put up his hands, and Pennington, coming down the road, disarmed him, and we put the cuffs on him. Then we did the best we could for McDougall. Wilcox. Wilcox died almost instantly. The rifle shot that had severed his finger had gone off his handgun and into his abdomen, and he was dead within minutes. It's interesting, again, looking at policing now and policing then. This is the newspaper headline of the day. Again, this is the day after the shooting. Police chief exonerated in slaying of Wilcox, commended for courage, did not intend to kill Bandit. It talks about how the bad guy fired first, and the jury, the coroner's jury was held the next day at the funeral home. If there was going to be a coroner's inquest now, it would be 2 years after the fact, so definitely times have changed. Probably the darkest day in Vancouver police history was the day that Charles Boyes and Oliver Linningham were murdered. So it was February 26, 1947, an informant tipped the VPD that there was going to be a robbery at the Royal Bank at First and Renfrew, which is still there. So police officers are responding to this area. The suspects have left by the time that the officers arrive. Actually, a couple officers en route see the car go by. They get into a high-speed pursuit and chase it through the neighborhoods of East Vancouver. They find the car abandoned on Kitchener Street in Vancouver, 2300 block of Kitchener. Detective Percy Allen Hoare, who is a veteran police officer and an excellent marksman, by the way, he finds this kid named Arnold Montgomery, and he says, hey, did you see some guys climb out of that car over there and run off? And he goes, yeah, they did. I saw them. They left and they went down to the Falls Creek Flats. So the Falls Creek Flats today is where that Home Depot is, right on First near Terminal and Clark area. This little kid climbs into the police car and he takes him down there. And there's actually, this was a CN rail station kind of area, lots of train tracks, and there's a little roundhouse down there. Also, plainclothes officers, boys in Lettingham also respond. So Detective Hoare gets to the area from one side, and Lettingham and boys come from what would be Terminal Avenue now, and they sort of converge on the area. Lettingham and boys find these three suspects and says, okay, come with me, boys. They're young guys, they're 17, 18, 19. Come with me, let's go back. And they're heading back towards Hoare, who's standing there with this little kid. And as they approach, Hoare walks up to him, and says this. He goes, the three men kept walking casually and never made a move as the officers rushed towards them. Then I saw them stop. Boys in Lettingham talked to them and showed them their badges. All five men turned and started walking toward me. As they came closer, I said, who are you fellows? And they didn't answer. And then I looked down and I saw something black hanging from the tall man, who turned out to be Carter's belt. I grabbed it, and it was an automatic pistol. One of the others stepped back and shot the policeman next to him. I don't know which officer it was. I dropped to the ground, and the men fired 3 shots at me. One of them got me as I fell. Then I took the gun away from the other one, and I started from the other one, and he started to run, and I let him have it with my gun. The automatic had dropped to the ground. I think I winged him. Then I got him again, and he went down. In just a few seconds, 16 shots had been fired. Lettingham and boys were dead. So, Harry Meadows, William Henderson, and Douglas Carter were the 3 bandits. Again, they're just kids. They're 18, 17 years old. Pretty amazing story from Detective Hoare, though. So he's been shot in the hip and he's been shot in the shoulder. Like I said, he was a pretty excellent marksman. He's down on the ground and he's got 3 shots left in his gun. And Meadows, Carter's dead already, shot by Hoare. Meadows and Henderson are running away. They're about 150 meters away, and he lobs his shots because he knows if he shoots in a straight trajectory, the bullets will drop by the time they get to him. So he's lobbing these shots and ends up hitting Meadows in the buttocks, which was great because he left a trail of blood. And they followed the trail of blood all the way to this house in East Vancouver. So it was a very sad day in the history of Vancouver Police. It was the largest funeral ever attended for a police officer's memorial. Over 100,000 people lined the streets of Vancouver to pay their respects. So on October 1st, 1947, Meadows was sentenced to death and the execution was carried out. He didn't die alone. Also, a fellow by the name of Houston, like I said, or it shows almost parenthetically, was also executed on the same day. He had killed a lady up in Belize Inlet at a logging camp. But certainly the story of the day was the execution of Meadows. He had attempted to commit suicide only hours before his execution. He had been complaining of a sore stomach, and when the guard, on death row, there would be a guard watching him 24 hours a day. When the guard came to see what was wrong, he said he had the sore stomach, so the officer went to get some medication for his stomach, came back, he had found a razor blade somehow, and he ended up slashing his wrists and nearly bled out, but they were able to save him long enough to execute him. So as you can see from this photo, there were other buildings that were built up over the years. There were cow barns. There was number 4 is the women's prison that was built in the 1940. There's a gymnasium. There's a young offenders unit, which then became the hospital. And it's kind of off picture there. Number 8 is what was called Westgate, which was a single level temporary facility built in 1952, which was operational until 1991, the temporary facility. And the inmates, because it was a temporary facility, the inmates were basically in cages. They didn't have their own running water or toilets in their cell. They had what was called a honey bucket to go in if they had to go in the middle of the night. And that honey bucket sometimes landed on other inmates, sometimes landed on guards. So as I said, there were several eras. Fast forward to the 1950s, became the rehabilitation era, where there was a complete transformation from punishing, a focus on punishing inmates for their wrongdoing, to trying to help them, heal them, make them better because there was something medically wrong with them. Hugh Christie was the warden at this time. He had a social work background, so most of the wardens came from a policing background. So he definitely had a different attitude towards the treatment of prisoners. But he was faced with a huge number of problems, and he tried to do all this reform and tried to implement it very quickly. One of the problems was he had about 100 trustees in this prison, and trustees are inmates who are given special privileges and not always locked up, so they could run errands and clean the floors and things like that. And he said, you know what, we got to slash it to about a dozen. I don't need 100 trustees running around. So that created a whole bunch of problems. Had a high number of heroin addicts in the prison. Huge problem with overcrowding. 900 inmates in the institution that was built for, for about a 500 capacity. Even though Westgate was open, there was lots of tension going on within the prison. That all exploded on October 2nd, 1952, with, at that time, was the worst riot in British Columbia history. The inmates, again, were upset about being double bunked. So they were out in the yard, they returned from the yard, overpowered the guards who were there, and then they actually barricaded the south wing so that there was a couple of guards left in the south wing. They weren't held hostages, but they were kept in there. And then the rest of the prison was basically barricaded from the south wing with tables, chairs, whatever they could get their hands on, and they put this barricade from ceiling to floor. Then they went on this, melee of smashing windows and trashing their cells, setting fires within the south wing. The women's prison joined in as well. They broke about 200 panes of glass in protest. So there was this inmate again, looking at the newspapers of the day, how again they would tell a story quite different from today. So usually, guards and police officers are not labeled as heroes in the newspaper anymore, but back then, certainly this fellow, Dick Reedy, what had happened was, although there was 12 RCMP officers called to the prison, they tried things like their fire hoses that they had on site, but they were rotten and they split, so then they had to get the fire department from Burnaby to come up with the fire hoses, and then they went and got a tear gas gun because they didn't have their own from BC Penn. The prisoners made a bunch of demands. Warden wanted nothing to do with it. So everybody was basically at a stalemate. So they had got an acetylene torch to cut through all this barricaded crap entering into the south wing. Then Brady grabbed a tear gas gun and he just stormed at the inmates, lobbing shots of tear gas at their feet as they retreated sort of up the stairs and onto the wings, and then the rest of the guards followed behind. But one of the things I wanted to really point out about this story is, again, what you would see in the newspaper. So the hero of Thursday's riot is 44 Royal Guard who risked death, Dick Brady of 408 South Esmond Street, Burnaby. Down here, Bob Burns of 3046 Miller, he was also there. Put their guy's address in. Oh, man. So even though Hugh Christie was a huge advocate for prison reform, he still ensured that the paddle was used on at least 25 of these inmates. He said, I don't like punishment, but it must be certain, immediate, and decisive when used. Many people have tried to change prisons by wiping out the punitive approach in the hope of instituting modern treatment. But they have failed because they have taken away the punishment before a modern system has been set up. So We'll hear about the modern system in a little bit. But one of the fascinating things that Hugh Christie advocated was, again, this sort of medical model, and like they literally went full on with a medical model. Dr. Guy Richmond was a senior medical officer there. There was also Dr. Edward Lewison. And they believed, especially Dr. Lewison, he believed that inmates were often criminals because they looked like criminals. And he believed that if you could correct defective features on these people, that they would be reformed. And so over a period of about 10 years, he performed 600 plastic surgery operations, over 15 years, such as rhinoplasties, tattoo removal, reshaping jaws, removing squints and scars, etc., in the hopes of reforming them. This is a quote that he wrote in a medical magazine. It says, "Formerly hostile and incorrigible individuals have become polite and gracious in their manner. Among them, a keen ambition developed to learn a trade and qualify for transfer to a vocational correctional center." Indeed, when the study was published, Lewison reported that only 42% of the plastic surgery patients reoffended upon their release, compared to 75% of the general inmate population. I'm not sure. There may have been some methodological issues with his research. Interesting, nonetheless. I'll talk about a hostage crisis quickly. Again, just to sort of give you a different flavor of some of these events that took place. So back in May of 1956, Robert the Frenchman Tremblay and his friends, Charles Talbot and Marcel Fernet, they had viciously beaten this guy with the help of their buddy, Robert Gordon. Any relation? So Robert Gordon had lured these people, this poor guy named Thomas Keena, down to False Creek again, and Frenchman and his buddies beat this guy almost to death. But they had been told that Gordon was going to change his testimony, and so there was an appeal. Well, Gordon never did change his testimony, and these guys were now looking at 25 years in the federal penitentiary. So on the day that they found out they lost their appeal, this guy Fernet, he was in court, he came back, Tremblay was in the yard, and he told them, look, we lost our appeal. They lose their mind, they run up the stairs of the West Wing, they grab Ernie Lovelace, and they drag him back on Tier 2 right to the barber shop, which was located at the end of the prison. Now, back then they had, for the inmates, they had these straight razors and long shears for scissors, which they would hang on the wall, which would have an outline of the scissors and the razors. So even though that there are these deadly instruments, and back then there was disposable razors, but the warden said, you know, disposable razors are actually like the bane of an institution, because they're so, you can take the razor blade apart, you can hide those razors anywhere and you'll never find them. This is very difficult to hide. The unfortunate thing is you could easily cut somebody's head off in about 2 minutes with that. So they grabbed for Ernie Lovelace and they dragged him back to the barber shop, and this became a 5-hour hostage ordeal. Tremblay says, I've got life, what the hell, I'll cut his head, or his throat and roll his head out to you. And the warden believed him. Of course, became a frontline story in the newspapers of the day. So the warden, he takes his rifleman. Now, when I worked at Oakalla, we just had shotguns and handguns. And the shotguns were full of birdshot. Honestly, like if you shot at an inmate, it would be more of an annoyance than anything. But back then they had actual rifles, you know, like a 30-06 hunting rifle. And so he sent his best marksmen out to go sight in their rifles. So if you can imagine the tension that was going on at the end of that tier. So Lovelace is being held hostage. He's got this straight-edge razor to his throat. It's Fernet and Tremblay. They're there. And in the distance, you can hear the sound of these rifle shots as the guards are sighting in their rifles. Pretty intense stuff. He then, the warden summoned a surgeon from the Royal Columbian Hospital to the prison. They brought in a bunch of plasma from the Royal Columbian Hospital. They escorted in a police car. So the warden tried a bunch of different tactics. How do we resolve this? So he first tried his wife to come up to the prison, Tremblay's wife. that didn't go very well, so sent her away. Then their lawyer came. Again, didn't go very well. So he's demanded, Trombley then demands, I want a reporter here. I want a newspaper reporter here. So Christie called Bruce Larson, who was the city editor of the province newspaper, and says, well, you got to try something. So Larson agrees, and he goes, okay, I'll go down. So he walked down the narrow tier to the end, and he sat there and he talked to Trombley for about another 3 hours and said, no, tell me your story. And he said, Trombley says, listen, if you print an extra edition of the province newspaper telling my story, I'll release Loveless. And so they did. It was probably the second time in the history of the newspaper that they actually printed an extra edition that night. And as the newspaper hit the streets, he let Loveless go. And they walked out of the tier together. So that was the picture the next day that said, this story for a life. So in up until the 1970s, Oakalla was truly a prison farm. It had hundreds of pigs, cattle, cows, crops, chickens. It was a self-sustained prison. The inmates, raised the animals, slaughtered the animals, used the food, used the crops to be self-sufficient. It was a vocational institution as well. All the license plates for the province of British Columbia used to be made in Oakalla Prison. It had a sheet metal shop, molding shop, upholstery, garage, tons of work. Almost all inmates in the institution worked. That all came to an end in the 1970s. There was a new Corrections Act which emphasized offender accountability, focus on community-based corrections, that I said. So we see this integration. Downsizing of prisons like Oakalla. Oakalla Prison Farm closed. It was renamed the Lower Mainland Regional Correctional Center. Everybody just called it Oakalla. It became a warehouse for prisoners. Very few prisoners actually had jobs. In Westgate, most of those inmates worked. However, if you were in the East Wing and the West Wing when it was occupied, very, very few of those inmates actually had jobs. So most of them sat on those tiers, narrow tiers, without employment for days on end. As other institutions across the province closed, became more community focused, they still had to do something with their troublesome charges who couldn't function anywhere else. It's not safe for them to be in the community, so they ended up in Oakalla too. So Oakalla became this powder keg of serious inmates who were very violent, many of them. And so it was little wonder that we saw in the 1970s and 80s a succession of riots that really nearly brought the prison crumbling, literally crumbling to the ground. I thought I'd show one little bizarre incident that happened at Oakalla in the 1970s. So we think about people trying to escape from Oakalla, and almost 900 people did escape from Oakalla over its history. But in July of 1970, a bunch of individuals called Yippies, which stood for Youth in something, it was a movement that, it started in the United States. It was kind of a combination of the hippie movement and this counterculture movement, social activism. So there was this group called the Vancouver Liberation Front that had published an article in the Georgia Straight newspaper saying, places like Oakalla house political prisoners, it houses people who have just committed no real crime, it's just a crime against the government type thing. They're going to jail for, stealing coins out of a telephone booth. And as I said, that wasn't the case. Most of the people in Oakalla by then were very violent. Plus there's people waiting trial for murder in many other cases. But they said, you know what, we're going to tear Oakalla down. So they had a big party at a park nearby. And at Forest Glen Park, there was about 300 protesters showed up there. And then they marched up Royal Oak Avenue and they decided that they were going to tear the prison down. So they started tearing a fence down. There was about 100 of them actually started yanking on this fence. And when prisoners escape from Oakalla, we usually don't know till after the fact, but if people are going to storm Oakalla, we knew in advance. So we were well prepared, and there's lots of guards, 85 guards, plus about 50 Mounties on scene to stop them from actually entering the prison and tearing it down. So we waited till 91 to do that. So. I thought I'd end with probably the story that most of you are familiar with, and that was probably the most dramatic event that happened in recent memory at this prison, and that was the '87 riot and New Year's Day escape. And there are people here who were intimately involved in this, and I'll try to keep it as factual but as short as possible. It actually was a series of events that started. First of all, it started with around Christmas time of '87. There was a rumor that there was going to be an escape from the south wing, and we in fact did find some damaged cells, and it looked like there was indeed some inmates who were going to try to mount an escape. December 27th was a Sunday, and there was a church service. Now, the church service was located up near the observation area in the center block of the prison, near the roof. And inmates from the other wings could go, so you'd have inmates from the remand south wing as well as inmates from the sentenced east wing together in the church service, but they had to stay separate from one another, and for security reasons obviously, and they weren't allowed any communication with each other. Well, this one inmate was removed by an officer who's here, and he was removed, and he was taken out for communicating with the other inmate, and he was brought down a flight of stairs. Now, there are several versions of what took place, but at the end of the day, I was standing in Center Hall, and this inmate who had been removed from the church service was standing at the gate, and he was handcuffed behind his back, and he had been involved in a scuffle with the guard, and now he had blood pouring down his face. Well, another inmate from the south wing had seen this, and he ran up the stairs to the rest of the south wing inmates yelling that the guards had beat up an inmate while he was handcuffed. That set off the initial disturbance. There were several cells smashed, fires lit, and I remember it was very incredibly loud, and like I said, I was working in the center hall area, and one of the older guards relieved me and said, "You can go help put that unrest down inside the south wing." And I was like, "Oh God." So it was myself and a couple of other young junior officers, and we were basically standing on this landing. Like I said, so it would be kind of there'd be a landing on each level, so we were on this second landing here, and there's a gate at the end, a 79-year-old gate at the end of this landing, and three of us are just standing there deciding how we're going to formulate a plan, because we don't really have a lot of resources, how we're going to lock these inmates up in their cells, because they weren't locked in their cells, but they were locked on the end of the tier, but we could hear them smashing furniture and sinks and toilets and everything. And while we're standing there, I just clearly remember out of the side of my eye, I just catch this sink flying through the air, and it smashed against the end gate about a foot away from where I was standing, and pieces of porcelain, end up coming through the gate. And I just remember, and the whole gate just kind of shook, and I thought, oh my God, if this gate gives way, we're dead. And we could see inmates brandishing spears, snapping poles. One of the officers saw an inmate with a knife. We're like, oh God, we're in big trouble here. Eventually, the inmates all get locked up, fires put out, some of the cells were destroyed, but it wasn't too bad. But we weren't satisfied. There was a minor search of the tiers. A lot of the weapons that were seen weren't discovered. It was kind of done in a haphazard fashion, the search. So the next day, we had our riot team there in place, and we said, we're going to actually do a full search. And the thorough search, one of the first inmates who was searched refused to a strip search. He picked up a garbage can, I think it was, and threw it at one of the guards. And it was just utter chaos after that. Virtually every cell in the wing was now destroyed. The inmates went on a rampage, lit all kinds of fires. And there's the results of what you would see. Guards would get out their fire hoses and walk on the catwalks outside of this barrier area, spraying, putting out the fires, as well as it was a way of subduing the rioting inmates who were, as you can imagine, now the windows to the exterior were smashed, so the cold air, December cold air is blowing in, there's no heat, the electricity's turned off because of the fires, and the water, so then now the inmates are freezing cold, some of them are injured. The East Wing, some of the East Wing inmates also joined in the fracas, so there was about 20 of them as well. So the problem then became, what do we do with these riding inmates? So most of them were moved to the West Wing, but we didn't want that wing to then go up in flames as well. So the decision was made, most of them who were placed in the segregation unit, which was part of Westgate, but that was filled up pretty quick. So the decision was, let's open up the old segregation unit, which hadn't been opened up in about 25 years. It was beneath the cow barns. And it really was like a dungeon. That's one of the cells. So the old segregation unit was opened up beneath the cow barns. 14 of the most violent rioters ended up in the old segregation unit. Problem was, few guards were familiar with the locking operation, the mechanisms of how they worked, because it hadn't been used in 25 years, so how would anybody know how anything worked? I have this little video clip. So there's the cow barns. This will just sort of take you through what it looked like if this works. So those are the stairs leading down beneath the cow barns. Some of the inmates had complained when they were taken down there that they had to run a gauntlet of guards beating them. There really was no evidence to support that. There were some injured inmates, no doubt, but most of it had occurred during the rioting. These are your typical cells down there. You know, it's dark, it's scary, it's narrow. But I think you'll see it rounds the corner here, the video. And at the far end of these cells are what are called quiet cells. This is the little booth where the guards are supposed to stay. Again, there's toilets on the outside. Now, this is a narrow hallway that you're looking at, cells on either side. And see how it even narrows even more? Well, where it narrows even more, those are quiet cells. And they had these very heavy wooden exterior doors. And then inside, about 2 feet inside, was a plastic door, a plexiglass door. So I'll just explain how those plexiglass doors work. So because it was a quiet cell and there was nothing in there, it was basically like a dungeon cell. But the plexiglass door had a food slot on the bottom. So you could go in and pass the food on a tray to the inmate. Now, to open that plexiglass door, there was a lever arm system that was about 2 feet long, and it had a handle, like a squeeze handle. And if you just squeeze that handle, you could push the arm down, and then you could open up that door and the plexiglass door. So there were some problems on this day. So on December 30th, the warden went in and viewed the old segregation unit, and he instructed the guards to run the unit like a regular unit. Inmates were provided with things like blankets, tobacco, toiletries, disposable razors, toothbrushes. The Salvation Army came around a couple of times, gave the inmates bags of candy, bags of peanuts, things like that. Because those quiet cells at the very back were very cold, they didn't get any warm air coming into them, the order was given to leave those wooden doors open. So the only sense of security now was that the plexiglass door with the lever. Unfortunately, there's a false sense of security in this unit. You know, if they had done their homework, the management of the day, they thought that this unit was actually the most secure unit. It was the most dungeon-like unit, but it certainly wasn't secure. If you escaped from your cell, the key to get out of that unit was with the guards who were in there. Unlike all the other units in the prison, if you got out of your cell and you even took the guards hostage, there's a cage area where you would have to somehow get into the cage where the other staff members were, who would control the access doors in and out of the unit. Here, you got the keys, you got out. So high incentive for escape. It was a comedy of errors, not funny at all, but guards were not issued emergency pagers. The radio to communicate with the central control was out of order. The only means of communication between these two guards and the underground segregation unit with maximum security inmates and center control was a rotary dial telephone. So unfortunately, you had these two officers who had to work New Year's Eve. Right, so they're showing up at their shift, 10 o'clock at night. One of them had 6 months experience, and the other one had 2 years experience. I talked to these guys after, one of them, and again, he said, I've never been down there before. I had no idea who was down there. Well, it was all maximum security inmates from the south wing. Some of them had, one of them for sure was in there for murder. Many of them were in there for violent robberies, looking at serious federal time. Didn't even really know who was down there. Didn't understand the locking mechanism operation. It was a recipe for disaster. So it's 10 o'clock at night. As they're doing their checks, the inmates, again, they're allowed to smoke, but they weren't allowed to have matches, so the guards would have to go light their cigarettes for them. As this is going on, one of the inmates, McKay, he escaped from his dark cell, and he opened up White's cell. So how did he escape from his dark cell? He took some strips of cloth, he took a bag of peanuts, put the bag of peanuts in a sock, tied this strip of cloth to this sock, reached underneath this port, and he just kept flipping up this bag of peanuts tied to this cloth until it wrapped around that handle, and then he just pulled it, and up went the lever, and he just exited out of his cell, and then he just stood there in darkness, pitch black down there. So then he went over to the other cell and opened up White's cell. So now the two of them are standing at the back. So now the inmates are calling, "Hey guard, can you come get us some water? Can you come give us, light a cigarette? What time is it?" Both officers would go together, but what they were trying to do was separate them. And eventually they did. One was getting water while the other one's up at the other end, far end of the tier. And now he's got them separated. As Officer Fenton gets to the far end, the two inmates come out and circle his neck with this toothbrush with a razor melted into it that had been given to them, and now takes him hostage, starts to slice one of the officers' throat. There's a little bit of blood. They threaten to kill him, and they say to Officer Banis, "Hey, if you don't hand over the keys, we're going to kill your partner." Banis decides he's going to fight with these guys, but then they drag him out. He sees the blood coming from him, and he's like, I gotta give up the keys. So he gives up the keys, thinks he's going to save his buddy. I just want to read to you. So I talked to Officer Banis shortly after, or a little while after, and this is what he had to say. "I lay down and they threw a towel over my head, and then there was chaos after that. They were running around, and an inmate took the keys off me, went into the office, got a pair of handcuffs, and handcuffed me with my arms behind my back. I could see Officer Fenton being tied up with a torn sheet. At first it was just two of them. Then they started opening the cells. That's when everybody started running around saying, 'Kill the pigs, kill the pigs.' Some of the other inmates were saying, 'No, leave the pigs alone, you're free.' I thought I was dead. The first thing I said to myself was, 'Jesus, I hope being killed doesn't hurt too much.' The towel came off my face and I had my glasses on. I looked up and I saw this big Aboriginal guy. He's staring down at me and I thought, oh God, here it comes. I said, 'Please don't kick me in the face. I don't want to be blind, please.' He took the glasses off my face and then he put them in my shirt pocket and he retied the towel over my head. He was lucky. They then took the two officers and they dragged them into the cell and they locked them in the cell. They had the keys to the exterior. One inmate decided, I don't want any part of this. Locked himself in a cell, and the 13 other dangerous inmates fled into the night. It was probably the biggest embarrassment for the provincial correctional system at that time. The Premier ordered an investigation. Len Doust was appointed as commissioner to investigate the escape of these prisoners. They were all eventually, within a month, I think, all of them were rearrested. There were some carjackings and other fairly serious crimes occurred that night when they escaped, and a few of them committed some other crimes while they were on the lam. So there was this commission of inquiry, and there were many recommendations that came out of them, mostly to do with security, treatment of inmates, etc. But the number one recommendation was to close Oakalla's doors permanently. And that's exactly what they did. So on June 30th, 1991, the last inmate left Oakalla Prison, and shortly thereafter, a wrecking ball knocked down those Claiborne bricks, and Oakalla is no more.